The Honda Civic made a sound like a cough, then a rattle, then nothing at all. Nora Marsh guided it to the gravel shoulder with both hands tight on the wheel and the engine already gone quiet beneath her. She turned the key twice. Nothing. The check engine light had been glowing since February, an orange warning she had learned to ignore the same way she had learned to ignore most things that couldn't be fixed with the money she didn't have. She sat there for a moment in the sudden silence, listening to the wind move through the corn stubble on both sides of Route 11, and then she pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and breathed. She was 20 years old. She had $57 in her jacket pocket. She had a duffel bag in the back seat and a dead car on a stretch of Kansas highway that looked exactly the same in both directions. Flatland fence posts, a sky that went on too long. She grabbed the duffel from the back seat. She reached into the glove compartment and took out the tin. It was olive green, dented on one corner, small enough to fit in the palm of her hand. Her grandmother Ruth had kept a sewing kit in it for as long as Nora could remember. Needles and thread and a thimble and a measuring tape and a photograph of Ruth tucked inside the lid, creased down the middle from being folded and unfolded so many times. Nora had carried it through every group home, every shelter, every back seat she had slept in since the night Ruth died, and the state of Ohio decided she was someone else's problem. She locked the car out of habit, even though there was nothing left inside worth stealing, and she started walking. The sign said Harlan, 2 miles. The September sun was dropping. The air carried that sharpness that arrives in early fall in the middle of the country, a smell like dry earth and something ending. Nora walked with the duffel over one shoulder and the tin in her jacket pocket, and her eyes on the road ahead. She had learned not to look too far back. Looking back was how you lost your footing. Harlan appeared slowly the way small towns do when you come at them on foot. A water tower in the distance painted white with the town name in blue letters that had faded to gray. Then a church steeple, then rooftops. Main Street was 4 blocks long and looked like it hadn't changed much since sometime in the middle of the last century. A hardware store with hand-lettered signs in the window. A post office. A diner called Rosie's with a neon open sign that flickered on one side. A barber shop with a closed sign that looked permanent. She smelled fried onions from the diner and her stomach pulled tight. She had eaten half a gas station sandwich at noon and saved the other half in the front pocket of her duffel. She was good at that. She had been good at that for 2 years, ever since the foster system let her go at 18, with a garbage bag of clothes, a bus ticket to nowhere specific, and the understanding that she was now entirely on her own. At the far end of Main Street, the county courthouse had its parking lot full of pickup trucks and folding chairs. A man with a microphone stood on a flatbed trailer and held up a clipboard. Nora drifted closer because it was something to look at, and because standing still in a strange town with $57 felt worse than moving. The auction was already partway through. A John Deere mower went for $80. A shipping container sold for $90. Someone paid $220 for a box truck with a transmission problem that the auctioneer mentioned once and moved past quickly. The crowd was mostly men in work boots and seed caps, farmers and contractors, and a few older couples who seemed to come for the social aspect as much as anything else. Lot 14, the auctioneer said, and his voice shifted into something different, a little lighter, a little theatrical. He smiled at the crowd the way a man smiles when he already knows the punchline. Half-acre parcel on the east side of town, formerly the site of the municipal water tower. Tower collapsed during a windstorm in 2016. Parcel includes the foundation slab, all remaining debris, and whatever wildlife has taken up residence since. We're opening at $5, folks. $5 for a half acre of Harlan real estate. Nobody moved. A few people laughed. Come on, $5. You spend more than that on coffee. Silence. The auctioneer raised his gavel. Going once. $5, Nora said. Every head in the crowd turned. She felt the weight of those stares the way you feel weather coming, that pressure in the air before something breaks. She was 20 years old with a duffel bag and dirt on her jeans, and she had just bid on a pile of rubble in a town she had walked into on foot 40 minutes ago. The auctioneer blinked. We have $5. Do I hear 10 silence? Sold, he said, and brought the gavel down. Lot 14 to the young woman in the back. See the clerk for paperwork. A man in a green seed cap leaned toward the woman beside him. She just bought herself a pile of junk, he said. The woman shook her head slowly. Poor thing, she said. Nora did not care what they thought. She needed somewhere to sleep, and a half-acre of land with her name on a deed was better than a highway shoulder. She walked to the clerk's table. The woman behind it was in her 60s, reading glasses on a beaded chain, the kind of county employee who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing. The clerk took her $5 bill without comment and had her sign 3 forms. She handed Nora a folded property deed. Lot 14, the clerk said. Take Maple East past the grain elevator, then right on Tower Road. She paused and considered. You can't miss it. She paused again. Well, you can't miss what's left of it. Nora followed the directions. The sun was almost gone now, the sky gone deep orange at the western edge, and she walked east on Maple with the deed in her duffel and her jacket zipped against the first real cold of the season. She passed the grain elevator and turned right on Tower Road and walked a quarter-mile along a dirt track before she saw it. The lot was exactly what the auctioneer had described, and nothing more. A half-acre of overgrown weeds and gravel surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence, with a gate that hung open on one hinge. In the center, the remains of a water tower lay scattered across the ground, like something enormous had come apart from the inside. Twisted steel beams and broken concrete, and a cylindrical tank that had split open along one seam and now lay on its side half buried in dirt and wild grass, open to the sky. It was a wreck, but the ground was flat. The fence offered privacy on 3 sides. Near the north edge, where the remains of a concrete wall still stood to about shoulder height, there was a sheltered space just large enough for a tarp and a sleeping bag. Nora climbed through the gate and dropped her duffel. Then she heard it, low, uncertain, coming from inside the split tank. She stopped moving. She listened. The sound came again, a thin whimper from somewhere inside the dark space of the fallen cylinder. She picked up a length of rebar from the nearest pile and walked slowly toward the opening, holding it loose at her side. The last light of the day came through the gap in the steel at a shallow angle and lit the inside in long strips of orange and shadow. She saw him against the far wall. A German shepherd, long-legged and thin, his ribs visible beneath a coat that had gone rough and dull from months without care. Dark eyes watching her without blinking. One front leg held slightly off the ground when he shifted his weight, favoring it long enough that he had adjusted his whole posture to account for it. He didn't growl. He didn't run. He just watched her with those dark eyes and waited to see what she was going to do. Hey, Nora said softly. Hey, it's all right. She set down the rebar. She reached into her duffel and pulled out the other half of the gas station sandwich. Turkey and Swiss on bread that had gone a little stiff. She unwrapped it and set it on the ground just inside the tank opening, and then backed away several steps and stayed still. The dog waited a full minute. Then he stood limped forward on that careful front leg and ate the sandwich in 3 bites. When he finished, he looked up at her, and after a moment, his tail moved once. A single cautious wag. Tentative. The gesture of an animal that had learned not to expect much. You live here, Nora said. The tail moved again. Yeah, she said. Me too, I guess. She spent the first hour making camp. She had a tarp and a length of paracord in her duffel left over from a period when she had slept outside more nights than inside, and she rigged it between 2 concrete chunks and a length of rebar driven into the ground. She made a rough bed with her jacket folded under her head and a spare shirt across her legs for warmth. By the time she lay down, the stars were fully out. She had always been in cities. She had grown up under fluorescent lights in group homes and through shelter windows crisscrossed with wire. She had never seen a sky like this one. No ambient glow to dull the edges, just stars all the way to the horizon in every direction, more of them than seemed real or reasonable. She lay on her back and looked up at them for a long time without thinking about anything specific. The dog crept closer during the night. When she woke at some point in the dark hours, he was pressed against her side, his head on her arm, his breathing slow and even. She didn't move. She lay still and let him stay. She called him Duke. She wasn't sure why. It suited him something in the way he carried himself, even with the injured leg, a certain quiet dignity that had survived whatever he had been through before she showed up. The first 3 days were about survival in the most basic sense. She found a public restroom at the back of the courthouse building that stayed unlocked during business hours. She filled water bottles at the sink. She ate sparingly and stretched her remaining money with bread and peanut butter from a gas station 2 miles down the highway on the far side of town. She went back to the car twice with the idea of seeing if she could find someone to help, but both times she turned around. She had learned that asking for help had a cost she couldn't always anticipate, and right now she couldn't afford surprises. She worked. She worked from the first morning, clearing rubble by hand, dragging steel beams to the fence line where they couldn't trip her, stacking broken concrete in rough piles sorted by size. She didn't have gloves. By the end of the first day, her palms were raw and her shoulders ached in the good way that exhaustion feels when it comes from work you chose to do. Ruth had told her that. When everything else falls apart, you use your hands. Ruth had said that to her more times than she could count, standing in the narrow kitchen of their apartment in Columbus, fixing something the landlord should have fixed, showing Nora how to hold a wrench or patch a section of drywall or replace a faucet cartridge without calling anyone. Ruth had died on a Tuesday afternoon while Nora was at school. Heart attack. No warning, no goodbye. Nora had come home to a neighbor in the hallway, and the understanding that the only person who had ever consistently chosen her was gone, and that the state of Ohio was going to step in and make decisions now. She worked because working was the closest thing she had to Ruth. On the fourth morning, a pickup truck slowed on Tower Road and pulled to the shoulder. A woman climbed out. She was in her early 60s with silver hair cut close and hands that showed decades of real work. She wore a canvas apron over her shirt and carried a water jug, the industrial kind that contractors use on job sites. "You're the one who bought this lot," the woman said. She said it the way people in small towns state things they've already verified as a formality before the conversation. "That's me," Nora said. The woman held out the water jug. "Della Pruitt. I own the hardware store on Main. Thought you could use this." She looked at Nora's hands without saying anything about them. Then she reached into the truck bed and came out with a pair of leather work gloves. "These too." Nora took the jug. She hesitated on the gloves. She had learned to be careful with gifts from people she didn't know. Everything came with a price, or got taken back, or meant you owed something you couldn't afford to owe. Della saw it in her face the way older women sometimes see things before they've been said. "They're just gloves," Della said. "I've got a store full of them. Come by if you need anything else. I'll put it on a tab. I can't carry a tab right now. I didn't ask you to pay one right now." Della looked around the lot, taking in the sorted piles, the cleared section of foundation, the tarp shelter, Duke sitting beside Nora, with his ears forward and his eyes on the stranger. "That tower's been sitting like this for 8 years, Della said. "The county talked about cleanup twice and never did it. You've been here 4 days and already done more than 8 years of county meetings accomplished." She climbed back into her truck. "That counts for something." She drove away. Nora put on the gloves. They fit well. Della came back every 3 or 4 days. She never stayed long and never asked personal questions. She brought water, once a bag of sandwiches from the diner, once a box of heavy-duty trash bags that turned out to be exactly what Nora needed for the loose debris. She would look at the progress nod once in that economical way of hers and leave. "Some things are worth more than what they cost," she said one afternoon, looking at the emerging foundation. $5. She shook her head, but she was almost smiling when she said it. At the end of the third week, Nora was pulling a section of collapsed steel paneling off the east edge of the foundation when she heard tires on the dirt road. A truck parked at the fence, a plain one, no logo, just a man inside who sat for a moment before climbing out. He was in his early 70s, white-haired, wearing a flannel shirt tucked neatly into work pants. He carried a metal toolbox by the handle, the kind that has been knocked around for years and still closes properly because the hinges were built right. He stood at the gate and looked at the lot for a long moment. Then he looked at Nora. Orrin Briggs, he said, I live about a quarter-mile east. He pointed in the direction of a farmhouse visible through a break in the trees. I've been watching you work from the road every morning for 3 weeks. Wanted to see if you'd stick with it. Nora wiped her hands on her jeans, and most people would have quit by day 3, he said. He walked through the gate and set the toolbox down and looked at the cleared foundation the way a carpenter looks at a flat surface, checking level, checking square, without a tool, just from long habit. You've done all this by hand. Don't have much else. He nodded as if that was a completely reasonable answer. He opened the toolbox. Hammers, a tape measure, a framing square, a set of chisels that had been kept clean and sharp for years. He had taken care of these tools the way men of his generation took care of things they respected. I'm a retired carpenter, he said. My wife Carol passed 2 years ago. I've been building birdhouses in my garage because I needed something to do with my hands, and my daughter kept telling me to stay busy. He looked up. I've made enough birdhouses for every bird in 3 counties. You've got a cleared foundation and no structure. If you want help framing something real, I'm available. Why? Nora asked. He thought about it for a moment. Not performing the thinking, actually doing it. Because Carol, he said, she would have been out here on day 1 with lumber and sandwiches if she'd been alive. That was her way. I'm slower than she was. But I got here. Nora studied him. He had steady hands and clear eyes. He didn't try to sell her on anything or fill the silence with words that didn't matter. Duke walked over and sniffed his boots carefully, then sat down beside him. Duke had not done that with anyone except Nora and Della. She looked at the dog, then at the old carpenter. Okay, she said, show me how to frame a wall. He smiled. It changed his whole face. Get me 2 sawhorses and a straight piece of lumber, he said, and I'll show you everything I know. They started that afternoon. Orrin brought more tools from his garage the next morning, and a stack of scrap lumber he'd been collecting from jobs over the years, good stock, straight, grain worth keeping. He showed her how to measure and mark, how to read a framing square, how to drive a nail clean on the first swing instead of bending it on the second. He was patient in the way of someone who has taught these things before and understood that patience was the actual tool. They didn't talk much while they worked. That suited Nora. She had grown up in places where silence was something other people filled with noise because they were uncomfortable with it, and she had never understood that. Silence was fine. Silence meant you were paying attention. By the end of the first day together, they had a wall section laid out flat on the foundation. 16-inch centers, top plate and bottom plate, and studs between everything square. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That's solid work, Orrin said, stepping back to look at it. I had a good teacher, Nora said. My grandmother taught me to fix things. Plumbing, drywall, electrical. She said the best thing about fixing something is that it stays fixed. Orrin picked up a nail from the ground and put it in his pocket, the instinct of a man who never wasted anything. Carol would have liked her, he said. On the 17th day, Nora was clearing the last section of steel paneling from the east edge of the foundation when Duke began to dig. He had been circling the center of the slab all morning, stopping at one particular spot near where 2 large sections of the concrete met. She had told him to stop twice. He kept coming back. Now he was digging with real intent, his front paws throwing dirt and gravel back between his legs, his nose going down into the hole every few seconds, a low, continuous sound in his throat that was not quite a whine and not quite a growl. Duke. Hey, stop. He didn't stop. Nora walked over and crouched beside him. The concrete here was different than the rest of the slab. She ran her gloved hand along the surface and felt it before she saw it. A seam. Not the irregular fracture lines from the tower's collapse, but a deliberate straight line, a joint where 2 sections of concrete had been poured separately and the gap between them filled with something dark and smooth. She pressed her thumbnail into it. Tar or a heavy caulk, something that had been applied with intention. She knocked on the surface to the right of the seam. Solid, dense, the sound of concrete all the way down. She knocked on the surface to the left. The sound came back hollow. Nora sat back on her heels. Her pulse had shifted. She had been around enough construction work over the years, enough time helping Ruth patch and repair things to know what a standard concrete foundation looked like. Poured slab rebar anchor bolts around the perimeter. Simple, predictable. But a sealed separate panel in the center of a foundation with a hollow space beneath it was not standard. Someone had built this deliberately. Someone had put this here on purpose. She borrowed a pry bar from Della's store the next morning without explaining why. Della handed it over without asking. Nora came back to the spot and worked the flat end of the bar into the seam and pushed. The old sealant crumbled along the edge. She pushed harder, and the panel shifted a quarter inch, just enough to confirm what she'd suspected. There was a space underneath. Duke paced in a tight circle, whimpering. She worked for 2 hours. The concrete was thick, close to 4 inches, and the panel came apart in sections that had to be levered up and pulled aside one at a time, with the full weight of her body on the bar. She worked until her arms burned and her hands ached inside the gloves, and sweat came through her shirt despite the October chill. When the opening was finally wide enough, she looked down. A chamber, 6 feet deep, 4 feet across. Concrete walls poured clean and straight-lined with a material she couldn't immediately identify, something dark and smooth that had been applied to every surface. The floor was dry, not damp from age, not cracked from freeze and thaw, genuinely dry. Whoever built this had understood drainage, waterproofing, structural integrity. They had built it to last. And at the bottom, resting at the center of the floor, was a box, wooden, wrapped in dark oilcloth, secured with twine that had gone brittle with years. Nora stared at it. The September wind crossed the open lot and moved through the broken steel behind her. Duke leaned forward over the edge of the opening and barked once, a single sharp sound that echoed briefly in the chamber and then was gone. She lowered herself in. The drop was about 5 feet, and she landed with her knees bent. The chamber smelled like mineral earth, and the stillness of air sealed away for decades. She crouched, let her eyes adjust to the dim light, and lifted the box. It was heavier than it looked. She got her hands under it and climbed back out and set it on the concrete slab beside the opening. Duke pressed his nose against it immediately and sniffed along every edge. "Easy," she said. "Let me see." She cut the twine with her pocket knife. The oilcloth fell away in stiff folds, revealing a wooden box with dovetailed corners and a fitted lid with a small brass hinge. No lock. The wood was dark walnut, the grain close, and even the surface smooth in a way that spoke of care and time. Someone had built this with real skill and real attention. Someone had wanted whatever was inside to last. She opened the lid. Inside, packed tightly and arranged with precision, were 4 things. A leather-bound journal, the cover worn to a deep brown, the spine cracked along 2 parallel lines from being opened many times. A stack of photographs wrapped in wax paper, the paper gone translucent with age. A bundle of papers tied with a ribbon that had once been blue, in a sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges. Handwriting across the front in ink that had gone from black to brown with the years. She picked up the envelope first. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the script of someone who had learned penmanship in school in a time when it was taught as a serious skill. The letters were even and clear, and Nora read them without difficulty. "To whoever carries the Marsh name forward." Her hand went still. She read the words again, then a third time. Marsh. Her name, her mother's name, her grandmother, Ruth's married name. The name Ruth had carried after the marriage ended, and the man was gone. But the name stayed, passing to Diana and then to Nora, the only continuous thread across 3 generations of women who had each been left to manage on their own. She set the envelope down carefully. She picked up the journal instead. The leather was soft and cool in her hands. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was different here, younger and more fluid, written with confidence. The date was April 12th, 1957. Started work on the municipal water system today. The council voted 6-1 to approve the project. Mayor Daniels shook my hand and said the town had been waiting 20 years for clean water. I told them we'd have it running by fall. My name is Walter Marsh, and I am the Water Commissioner of Harlan, Kansas. Nora read the words once, then she read them again. Walter Marsh, Water Commissioner, the man who had built the tower she was sitting on. She turned pages carefully, holding the edges, aware that she was holding something that could not be replaced or replicated. Walter wrote about the work with an engineer's precision and something more than that, something like joy, the satisfaction of a man doing something he was genuinely good at and knew it. He wrote about pipe layouts and pump specifications, about digging trenches in the Kansas summer heat, about testing pressure gauges at midnight because he couldn't sleep until he knew the numbers were right. He wrote about his crew of 4 men and about the pleasure of watching a system work the way it was designed to work. And he wrote about his family. His wife, Margaret, brought him lunch at the worksite every day, arriving at noon in the same green truck, regardless of weather. He wrote about her the way a man writes about someone he has loved for a long time and intends to keep loving with an ease that comes from certainty. He wrote about their daughter, Diana. Diana is 3 today, he wrote in an entry from the summer of 1958. Margaret made a cake with pink frosting, and Diana got it everywhere in her hair, on the dog, on my good shirt. I don't care. She is the best thing I have ever built. Nora stopped reading. She looked at the page until the words blurred at the edges. Diana, her mother's name. Diana Marsh, who had died in a car accident in January of 2009 when Nora was not yet 4 years old. Diana, who Nora barely remembered a sound more than a face, a voice that sang in the kitchen, a hand that smelled like dish soap. She unwrapped the photographs. The first showed a young man in work clothes standing in front of a steel framework that reached into a clear summer sky. He was tall and lean, with dark hair pushed back from his forehead and a jaw that Nora recognized immediately because she had seen it in every reflective surface she had passed for 20 years. He was grinning at whoever held the camera, the unguarded grin of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. Behind him, the skeleton of the water tower rose half-built from the Kansas ground. Walter Marsh, her grandfather. The next photograph was a family portrait. Walter and a woman with light hair and steady eyes standing on the porch of a frame house, their shoulders touching. Then Walter holding a baby wrapped in a white blanket, his expression one of pure bewilderment and joy. Then a little girl, maybe 5 years old, sitting on the front step of the same house, with a gap-toothed smile that Nora had seen once before in a photograph Ruth had kept on the dresser. A picture of Diana Marsh as a small child, the only one Nora had ever known to exist. The same smile, the same gap between the front teeth, the same dark eyes. Diana Marsh, her mother, as a little girl in Harlan, Kansas, on the steps of her father's house. Nora set the photographs down on the concrete slab beside her. She tried to breathe. The lot was quiet around her. The wind had come down and the late afternoon light was going long and gold across the weeds along the fence line. Duke had stopped pacing. He lay down beside her and put his head on her knee and looked up at her with those dark eyes. She had spent her entire life believing she came from nothing. That was the story she had been given implicitly and explicitly by every system and every institution that had handled her. No family history, no roots, no one waiting for her anywhere. She had been passed along because nobody wanted her, and she had accepted that as the fundamental fact of who she was. But Walter Marsh had been a real man. He had built a real thing. He had stood in front of this tower with a grin on his face and his whole life ahead of him. He had called his daughter the best thing he had ever built. And somehow, through some chain of events that Nora did not yet understand, his granddaughter had bought the ground he'd built on for $5 at a county surplus auction on the day her car broke down on Route 11. She looked at the photograph of Walter standing in front of the half-built tower. Then she looked at the tower itself, what was left of it. The collapsed tank, the scattered steel, the concrete slab her grandfather had poured with his own hands nearly 70 years ago. Duke shifted against her leg. She picked up the journal again. She opened it to a page near the middle and read. She did not stop reading until the sun was fully gone, and she could no longer see the words without straining. She read the journal by firelight that first night, feeding scraps of lumber into a small fire she had built in a cleared section of the foundation, keeping it low and controlled the way Ruth had taught her when they camped once in a state park outside Columbus, the only vacation they ever took together. Duke lay close at her side, and she read until the fire burned down to coals and the cold pushed in from the open sky above. Walter Marsh had been a precise man. His early entries moved through the water project with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and wanted the record to reflect it not out of vanity, but out of professional integrity. The kind of man who believed that good work deserved to be documented as carefully as it was performed. He wrote about pipe gauges and pressure tests, about the weight-bearing calculations for the tower foundation, about sourcing steel from a supplier in Wichita who gave him a fair price because Walter had taken the time to learn the man's name and use it. But between the technical entries, there were other passages, quieter ones. He wrote about Harlan the way a man writes about a place he has chosen and means to keep, not the town he was born into, but the town he had decided to belong to, which is a different thing entirely. He wrote about the way Main Street looked on a Saturday morning in October, about the quality of the light over the wheat fields in late afternoon, about the sound of the grain elevator running on summer nights. He wrote about Margaret sitting on the porch after dinner with her feet up on the railing reading, not speaking just there. He wrote about Diana learning to walk by holding onto his finger with both hands and looking up at him with an expression of absolute concentration. These were the passages that Nora read slowly. These were the passages she read more than once. She slept a few hours and woke before dawn with the journal still in her hand and Duke's weight against her ribs and the stars beginning to fade at the eastern edge of the sky. She lay still for a while, listening to the silence of the lot, and thought about a man she had never known who had built something real in a place she had never heard of until 2 days ago. In the morning, she put the journal in the oilcloth wrap with the other items and tucked the bundle carefully inside her duffel. She went to work. She and Orrin had been working together for 2 weeks by then, and they had fallen into a rhythm that required very little negotiation. He arrived around 8 in the morning, having already had coffee at home, and driven the quarter-mile in his truck with whatever lumber or tools he thought they would need that day. Nora was already working when he arrived. He never commented on this. He simply set down his toolbox and picked up where they had left off. And they worked until the light went or until Nora's arms gave out, whichever came first. Orrin was teaching her to read a framing square the way it was meant to be read, not as a measuring device, but as a thinking tool. "It tells you what the lumber is going to do before you cut it," he said one morning, crouching beside a section of wall they were laying out on the slab. "You're not measuring, you're predicting." He handed her the square and showed her how to sight along the blade, how to feel for plumb with her whole arm rather than just her wrist. "Construction is a conversation between what you want and what the material will allow," he said. "The best carpenters listen more than they push." She listened. She learned quickly in the way of someone who has already spent years learning how things work from necessity rather than curriculum. Ruth had taught her the practical logic of repair, how systems failed and could be restored, how to trace a problem back to its source instead of patching the symptom. Orrin was teaching her something adjacent to that but larger in scope, how to build something that hadn't existed before, how to start from flat ground and bring a structure into being through a sequence of decisions that each had to be right or the ones after it would be wrong. She was driving a nail into a top plate one afternoon, the hammer coming down clean on the third swing when she heard tires on Tower Road, a vehicle she hadn't seen before. She finished the nail before she looked up. The SUV was black and clean in a way that stood out on a dirt road. It parked outside the fence and the engine sat for a moment before it cut off. The man who stepped out was in his mid-40s, broad through the shoulders with gray coming in at the temples of dark hair. He wore a blue dress shirt with the sleeves pushed to his elbows and the kind of leather shoes that cost more than Nora's car had been worth when it was running. He looked around the lot with the measured assessment of a man who is calculating rather than observing. Duke stood up from where he had been resting and moved to Nora's side without being called. His ears flattened. "You're the one who bought this parcel at the surplus auction," the man said. He said it the same way the county clerk had said it, as a statement rather than a question. I am, Nora said. She set the hammer down on the wall frame, but within reach. He walked to the gate and stopped there rather than coming through, as if he hadn't decided yet whether this was a courtesy call or something else. He pulled a business card from his shirt pocket and held it out. Reed Hargrove. Hargrove Development. Nora looked at the card but didn't take it. He set it on the top of the fence post. This property was included in the county surplus auction in error, he said. His voice was even practiced. The parcel was designated in the 2022 county master plan as a commercial zone overlay. That designation creates a procedural requirement before any surplus listing a requirement the assessor's office did not fulfill. I've already been in contact with the county's legal counsel and will be filing a formal challenge with the Board of Supervisors. The sale was legal, Nora said. I signed the paperwork with the county clerk. She confirmed it herself. Paperwork can be reviewed. Reed's voice didn't change. He was the kind of man who had learned to say difficult things in a tone that made them sound like administrative observations rather than threats. I'm not trying to create a problem for you personally. This is about a procedural gap that existed before you walked into that auction. The challenge is against the county, not against you. The outcome is against me. Something moved in his expression. Not quite surprise, more like the brief recalibration of a man who had expected a different kind of response. There will be a formal hearing before the Board of Supervisors, he said. 30 days from the date of filing. I'd suggest you take that time to consider your options. He left the business card on the fence post and walked back to the SUV. Nora watched it turn around on the dirt road and drive back toward the highway, the rear tires throwing a thin line of dust that the wind took apart before it settled. Duke leaned into her leg. Orrin had been watching from across the foundation. He set down his tape measure and walked over. Reed Hargrove, Nora said. Hargrove Development. She picked up the business card and looked at it. He's filing a challenge to the sale. Orrin looked at the road where the SUV had been. Hargroves have had their hands in this county for 3 generations, he said. His voice was quiet and without drama, the tone of someone stating geography. His grandfather was on the town council back in the 60s. Before my time, but people still talk about how that man did business. Nora looked at him. What kind of business? Orrin picked up his tape measure. The kind that looked legal on paper, he said. She went to see Della that evening. The hardware store was still open. The lights warmed through the front windows, and Della was behind the counter going through an order form when Nora came in. She told her about Reed Hargrove and the commercial zone overlay and the 30-day deadline. Della listened without interrupting. Come with me tomorrow morning, Della said when Nora finished. We'll go talk to Marion Harmon at the county clerk's office. She processed your deed. She knows these records better than anyone. Marion Harmon was at her desk when they arrived at 8 the next morning. She was the same woman who had taken Nora's $5 at the auction, reading glasses, on the same beaded chain, the same expression of professional composure. She pulled the file and spread it on the counter and went through each page with her finger. The listing was proper, she said. Parcel was declared surplus by the assessor's office 18 months ago. It went through the standard 90-day review window. She tapped the signature line. No objections filed during that period. The sale is clean. So Hargrove's challenge has no basis, Della said. I didn't say that. He can argue to the board that the assessor made an error or that the commercial overlay created an obligation the county didn't meet. The board can review that argument. But as of today, the sale is legally valid, and Miss Marsh is the owner of record. Nora let out a breath she had been holding since the previous afternoon. Marion looked at her over the reading glasses. For what it's worth, she said, I grew up in this town. I remember when that tower was standing. My father used to say the man who built it was the straightest dealer he ever met in county government. She closed the file. Good luck. The certified letter from Hargrove's attorney arrived 4 days later. Della brought it to the lot because Nora still had no address for mail, and Della had given them the hardware store address as a courtesy. She held it between 2 fingers, and her face said what her voice didn't. Nora opened it standing in the morning sun. The language was dense and formal and took 3 paragraphs to say what it could have said in 3 sentences. Hargrove Development was formally challenging the surplus sale of Lot 14. A hearing had been scheduled before the County Board of Supervisors in 26 days. In the interim, she was advised to refrain from any construction or structural modification of the property. She read to the bottom of the second page and stopped. There was a supplemental argument. New language from the attorney, a paragraph she had to read twice to understand fully. The attorney was asserting that the savings bonds recovered from the property had been purchased using Walter Marsh's salary as water commissioner, a public position funded by county appropriations. Under this theory, the bonds represented public funds improperly converted to personal use, and Hargrove's legal team intended to petition the court to freeze the assets pending an investigation of their origin. She stood with the letter in her hand and said nothing. Della read it over her shoulder. After a moment, she said quietly and without any particular emphasis, "That's what his grandfather did." Nora looked up. "Edmund Hargrove," Della said. "This is how he went after your grandfather 60 years ago. He couldn't find any actual financial wrongdoing, so he created the appearance of it. He raised questions, got people doubting. By the time the audit cleared, Walter, the damage was already done." She looked at the letter again. "And now the grandson is using the same weapon on you." That evening, Nora sat in the shelter with the journal open on her knee and read by the light of the work lamp Orrin had brought from his garage. She had been reading it in sections since the night she found it, carrying the weight of it forward in small amounts, because some of what it contained required time to process before she could take in more. The entries from the late 1950s had the quality of a man at the peak of his powers. The water system came online in the spring of 1958, 14 months ahead of the original schedule, and Walter wrote about it with a restraint that didn't quite conceal his satisfaction. Clean water to every tap in Harlan, every kitchen, every bathroom, every stock tank. He wrote about driving the routes after the system went live, stopping at houses along the way to run the faucets to check the pressure, to make sure the flow was right. He wrote about an elderly woman on the north edge of town who had been hauling water from a shared well for 30 years. She ran her kitchen tap and stood watching the water come out and didn't say anything for a long time, and then she looked at Walter and said thank you in a voice that made him have to look away. That was the kind of man he was, Nora thought. That moment was the kind of thing he chose to write down. Then around 1959, the tone began to shift. A man named Edmund Hargrove had moved into the county. He had money from somewhere east of Kansas, and he had been buying farmland in sections along the highway corridor northeast of town, assembling a large block of acreage with the intention of developing it into residential lots. It was a reasonable plan except for one practical problem. The land had no water source of its own adequate to support residential development. The only reliable municipal supply in the area was the system Walter had built. Edmund Hargrove came to the town council with a proposal. He would invest in expanding the water infrastructure fund, new mains, and additional storage capacity if the town would enter into a long-term contract granting Hargrove interests significant control over future allocations and pricing. He framed it as partnership. Walter saw it differently. He doesn't want to expand the system, Walter wrote in the fall of 1959. He wants to own it. If Hargrove controls the allocation, he controls who can build where. He controls who gets water and at what price. The municipal system stops being a public resource and becomes a private lever. I said this to the council. Half of them understood. The other half were looking at the number on Hargrove's proposal and doing arithmetic about their own property values. The entries over the following year grew darker in small increments the way weather changes before a storm. Edmund Hargrove began attending every council meeting. He made donations to local causes, visible ones, the kind that get your name on things. He hired the nephew of a council member. He took 2 council members fishing in Colorado. None of this was illegal. All of it was deliberate. Then, in the spring of 1960, the rumors started. Questions about whether the water commissioner's accounts were fully in order. Suggestions of discrepancies between purchase orders and receipts. A letter to the Harlan Courier from an anonymous source requesting a formal financial audit of the water department. The audit found nothing wrong. Walter had documented every dollar with the precision of a man who knew that precision was its own defense. Every purchase order matched every receipt. Every budget line was accounted for. The county auditor submitted a clean report in June of 1960, but the damage was done as Della had said it was. Three council members who had supported Walter changed their positions over the following months. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the quiet, incremental way that institutional loyalty shifts when the room temperature changes. By the fall of 1960, Walter could feel the mathematics moving against him. In March of 1961, the council voted 4-3 to restructure the Water Commission. The position of Water Commissioner was dissolved. A new position with a different title was created and filled by a man whose name Walter did not write down in the journal, as if recording it would give it more reality than it deserved. Same job, Walter wrote. Different name on the door. Different man inside. Everyone in this town knows what happened. The ones who did it know it most of all. The handwriting in these entries was different from the early ones. The letters pressed harder into the page. The lines ran slightly less even. Nora ran her finger along the indentations of the pen and felt the pressure behind them across 64 years. They left 2 weeks after the vote. Walter wrote about loading the truck in one terse paragraph. The house sold for less than it was worth because they needed to move quickly. Margaret's sister lived in Springfield, Missouri, and they drove south and stayed with her until Walter found work. He had the skills of a man who had built municipal water infrastructure from nothing. But they were specific skills, and the market for them outside of municipal employment was narrower than he had anticipated. He took plumbing jobs, pipe-fitting maintenance work at a grain processing facility outside Springfield. The work paid. It wasn't what the work in Harlan had been. He wrote about Diana starting school in a new town, quiet and watchful, in the way children become quiet and watchful when they have been pulled from somewhere familiar. He wrote about Margaret getting work as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm. He wrote about the dislocation of living adequately while feeling that something essential had been taken from beneath everything else. Nora set the journal on her knee without closing it and looked at the half-built wall frame across the foundation. Orrin would come tomorrow. The wall frame would be there when the light came back. She looked at it for a while and then she turned the page. The entries from the mid-1960s were shorter. Practical. Margaret's health became a recurring subject mentioned in careful language that grew less careful as the years went on. Treatment. Appointments. Costs that were given in numbers and then not given in numbers, the way people stop writing down expenses when the expenses become unbearable to quantify. She worked through these pages over 3 evenings, reading a little each night, and then setting the journal aside and doing other things, eating, tending to Duke's injured leg, with the salve Della had brought from the store lying on her back looking at the stars. On the 4th evening, she came to an entry from the spring of 1970. Margaret died on March 9th, Walter had written. I was with her. I held her hand until it was over, and I told her we would be all right. I don't know if that was true. She had been the structural element. Everything else in the house organized itself around her. He had not written again for 2 months after that. When the entries resumed, they were brief and reported events without much commentary. Diana finished high school. Diana started at the community college. Diana got a job at a restaurant downtown. Walter was 42 years old by then, living in a rented room in Springfield, working maintenance at the same grain processing facility outside the city. The skills that had built a municipal water system earned him enough to live carefully. It was not what the work in Harlan had been. And then in an entry from the fall of 1972, Walter wrote that Diana had left. She packed a bag on a Wednesday night while I was asleep and was gone before morning. Left a note on the kitchen table. She said she needed to find her own way. She said she would call when she was ready. She said she was sorry. He had written the word sorry and then underlined it once, not twice, just once, as if he was trying to decide how much weight to put on it. She never called. Walter hired a private investigator in 1973 and kept him on for 3 years. The man found traces, a job in Indianapolis, an apartment lease in Columbus under Diana Marsh, a forwarding address in Dayton that led to another address in Cincinnati that was already vacated by the time it was verified. Diana moved each time the trail got close, whether by coincidence or intention, Walter couldn't determine. The investigator's final report, filed in 1976, noted that the subject appeared to be deliberately maintaining distance and recommended suspending active search. Walter had written about reading that report 3 times in the same afternoon, sitting in the same chair each time. I stopped looking in 1980, he wrote. I was 52 years old, and the looking had become something I was doing to punish myself rather than to find her. She knew where I was. She had always known where I was. The choice to stay absent was hers, and I had to respect it, even when respecting it felt like accepting a verdict I didn't deserve. He wrote about turning 60, about a knee replacement that went well, and then a heart condition that required medication. He managed carefully, measuring doses, tracking symptoms, the self-management of a man who was determined to remain functional. He wrote about a neighbor named Greta who brought him dinner twice a week and whose company he valued without wanting it to become anything more than it was. He wrote about the grain facility closing and working part-time at a hardware store for 4 years until his knee made it impractical. He wrote about the lot in Harlan. He had kept the deed. Through every move, every packed box, every rented room, he had kept the deed to lot 14 in a manila envelope in the bottom of whatever bag served as his permanent storage. He wrote about it periodically, not with longing exactly, but with a kind of maintenance attention, checking that it was still there, still valid, still his. The one piece of ground with his name on it, the one thing that couldn't be restructured or reassigned. Nora sat with the journal in her lap and looked at her hands. Duke had been asleep against her leg for an hour. Outside, the wind had come up and was moving through the steel remnants along the fence line with a sound like something tuning an instrument it didn't quite know how to play. The work lamp threw a circle of warm light across the shelter and the journal and her hands and not much else. She turned the page. The handwriting changed. Not gradually, not over pages, but in a single clear break. The entry before was from some time in the fall of 2003, Walter's familiar even script, a brief note about a doctor's appointment. Then a gap of blank pages, 3 or 4 of them, and then the new writing began. It was still his handwriting, but aged, the letters slightly uneven at the edges. The pressure inconsistent in a way that comes when hands have lost some of the muscle certainty they once had. The pen had pressed harder in some places, lighter in others. It was the handwriting of a man in his early 80s, still careful, still clear, but carrying the weight of the years in the physical act of writing. The first of these entries was dated February 14th, 2010. A woman called me today. Her name is Mrs. Kellner, and she works for the state of Ohio Department of Family Services. She said she was calling because of Diana. Nora went very still. She read the sentence again. Then she kept reading. Mrs. Kellner said that Diana Marsh had died in an automobile accident on January 19, 2009. She was 53 years old. The accident had occurred on a highway outside Columbus, where Diana had been living for the past several years under her married name, which she had later reverted from. She had no spouse at the time of her death. She had been working as a restaurant manager. Mrs. Kellner said that Diana had a daughter. Nora's hands tightened on the journal. A little girl named Nora Walter had written. She is 4 years old. Diana had listed me as next of kin on a form she completed at the hospital when Nora was born. That form sat in a file for 4 years and only surfaced when the state was looking for family members after Diana's death. That is how Mrs. Kellner found me. That is the first time anyone has found me in 30 years. He had written those last 2 sentences and then left a space on the page before continuing. The space felt deliberate, as if he had needed a moment between the thought and what came next. I asked Mrs. Kellner immediately if I could take Nora. I asked her before she had finished explaining the circumstances. She said there would be an evaluation process. I am 82 years old. I have a heart condition that requires daily medication. I live in a 1-room apartment. I do not own a car. I told her I would do whatever was required. I told her I would move, I would get a car, I would do whatever the evaluation needed me to do. She said she would be in contact. The next entry was 11 days later. The state has denied my petition for guardianship. Their determination cites my age, my health condition, and my housing situation as factors that disqualify me from providing appropriate care for a minor child. The caseworker explained their reasoning in language that was professional and not unkind and completely final. I told her I was Nora's grandfather, her biological family, her only living blood relative that they had located. She said she understood that and that it was a consideration, but not in the state's assessment a sufficient one. I asked if I could at least see her. I was told that would not be appropriate given that I had not been part of the child's life. I have not been part of her life because nobody told me she existed until 11 months after her mother died. Nora set the journal down on her knee. She pressed both palms flat against the floor of the shelter. The wood was solid and cool under her hands. She concentrated on that, the reality of solid wood under her palms. She had spent 16 years in the system, 6 group homes, 3 foster placements, 2 shelters. She had spent 16 years being moved from one place to another by decisions made in offices by people who had access to information she was never given. She had gone to bed in more different rooms than she could count and woken up in all of them with the same fundamental understanding that she was not someone anyone had specifically chosen. She had believed because there was nothing to suggest otherwise that nobody had ever come looking. Duke lifted his head from her knee and looked at her. She picked up the journal. The entries after the denial were short. He called Mrs. Kellner every month for a year. She gave him updates in the careful language of institutional communication. Nora was in a group home in Columbus. Nora was doing well in school. Nora had been moved to a different facility. He wrote each of these updates down in a sentence or two, without commentary, the way a man records things he cannot change but needs to keep track of anyway. He sent a package to the group home address Mrs. Kellner eventually provided. A blanket he had knitted himself over several weeks. A photograph of Diana as a baby. A letter addressed to Nora. He wrote about not knowing whether any of it was delivered. He wrote about that uncertainty with a restraint that was more devastating than complaint would have been. Nora thought about the group home she had been in. She thought about the mail that sometimes arrived for residents and the indifferent way it was handled, sorted into bins, delivered late, occasionally lost. She thought about packages from people she didn't know, which were opened by staff, first assessed, sometimes returned. She would never know whether the blanket had reached her. She kept reading. The entries continued at long intervals through 2010 and 2011. Walter's health was a recurring subject, managed with the same methodical care he had brought to everything else. Medication adjustments, a mild cardiac event in the winter of 2011 that required a brief hospitalization. A period of physical therapy afterward that he described in terms of its practical progress rather than its difficulty. Throughout these entries, Nora was present. Not dramatically, not in long passages, but consistently a thread running through everything else. He mentioned her name in context that showed he was tracking whatever information he could access from a distance. She is 7 now, he wrote. She is in school. He did not have details beyond what Mrs. Kellner provided in their monthly calls, which had become quarterly by 2011 and then stopped entirely after Mrs. Kellner transferred to a different department. And then, near the back of the journal in the last section of pages that still had writing on them, there was a final entry. September 12th, 2012. I am going back to Harlan tomorrow. The handwriting here was the most uneven she had seen the letters form with effort, but still legible, still his. I know the tower is gone, or mostly gone. I know the town has moved on. But the chamber is still there. I built it to last 100 years, and it has been 51. The box is still sealed. I know this because I built it, and I know what I built. I have written a letter. I have addressed it to whoever carries the Marsh name forward. I am putting the letter inside the box with the bonds and the photographs and the journal. To do this, I need to open the foundation, place the letter, and reseal the panel. The sealant is in the truck. It is a 9-hour drive from Springfield. My heart is not good. My cardiologist has told me in clear terms that long drives and physical exertion are risks I should not take without preparation. I have prepared as well as I know how. I have my medication. I have the route mapped. I have the tools I need. I am 84 years old. I built that tower when I was 27. I built it to give a town clean water. I built the chamber to give something to whoever came next. If I can drive to Harlan and open the foundation and add the letter and seal it again, then something of what I did survives in the place where I did my best work. I am leaving in the morning. If Nora ever finds this, I want her to know that I tried. I want her to know that I asked for her and was told no and kept asking anyway. I want her to know that she was not forgotten. She was never forgotten. Not for a single day. That was the last thing Walter Marsh had written. Nora sat with the journal closed in her hands for a long time. The work lamp burned steadily. Duke had gone back to sleep, his chin resting on her knee, his breathing slow and even. Outside the shelter, the wind had eased and the lot was quiet. He had driven back. That was the only way the letter was in the box. He had made the 9-hour drive at 84 years old with a compromised heart, and he had opened the foundation and added the letter and resealed the panel, and then he had gotten back in the truck. She needed to know what had happened after that. In the morning, she walked to the hardware store and found Della opening up, pulling the security gate back from the windows, the routine of 30 years visible in the efficiency of the motion. Nora showed her the last journal entry without saying anything first. Della read it twice, standing in the doorway with the gate half open. Then she looked at Nora. County Library has the Harlan Courier on microfilm going back to 1940, she said. Come on. They drove in Della's truck, which smelled like sawdust and motor oil, and the domesticity of a vehicle that gets used for everything. The library was a single-story brick building on the far end of Main Street. The librarian, a thin man with a neat gray beard, showed them the microfilm reader and the cabinet of reels organized by year without asking what they were looking for. Della threaded October 2012 into the reader and worked through it page by page, the images rolling forward in the rhythm of microfilm, pausing at headlines, moving on, pausing again. The Harlan Courier in October 2012 was 12 pages, most of them local agricultural news and school board announcements, in the kind of small-town reporting that records the texture of ordinary life without knowing that it is also recording history. Della slowed the reel at page 7. The article was 4 paragraphs in the local section. It had no photograph. The headline was brief and factual in the way that local newspapers write headlines when the facts are sparse and the circumstances are unclear. Nora leaned forward and read, An unidentified man was discovered deceased in his vehicle on the shoulder of Route 11, approximately 40 miles west of Harlan, on the morning of October 4th. The Harlan County Sheriff's Department responded to a report from a passing motorist. The county coroner determined the cause of death to be cardiac arrest. The vehicle, a 1997 Ford pickup truck, was registered to Walter R. Marsh of Springfield, Missouri. Personal effects recovered from the vehicle included road maps and a small amount of writing materials. No next of kin has been located. The remains have been transferred to the county medical examiner's office, pending notification. Della put her hand on Nora's shoulder and left it there. 40 miles, Nora said. He had been 40 miles from Harlan. He had driven 9 hours from Springfield and gotten within 40 miles of the tower he had built 54 years ago. 40 miles from the chamber he had sealed, 40 miles from the lot that still had his name attached to it through a deed he had kept in the bottom of a bag through every decade of his life after leaving. He had made it far enough, though. He had opened the foundation. He had placed the letter. He had sealed the panel again before he got back in the truck. Whatever happened on Route 11, it had happened after the work was done. The box was in the foundation when Nora had opened it. The letter was in the box. The seal had held for 13 years after Walter drove away for the last time. He had made it far enough for that. Nora sat in the library chair and looked at the words on the microfilm reader for a long time without speaking. The librarian moved quietly somewhere in the stacks behind them. Della kept her hand on Nora's shoulder and didn't say anything else because there was nothing else that needed saying. Outside the library windows, Harlan went about its morning. A delivery truck on Main Street. A woman walking a dog along the courthouse sidewalk. The grain elevator turning over in the distance, its mechanical sound familiar and continuous. The ordinary hum of a town that had been doing what it did long before Nora arrived, and would keep doing it long after she was gone. Unless she stayed. She thought about that word on the drive back to the lot. stayed. It had felt for most of her life like something other people did in places that had been designed to hold them. She had never had a place designed to hold her. She had moved because moving was the only option, because the options that involved staying always turned out to belong to someone else. But this lot had her name on the deed. The foundation under it had been poured by her grandfather's hands. The chamber beneath it had held his whole life sealed and waiting for 51 years until a German shepherd with a bad leg and a 20-year-old woman with $57 walked through a gate that hung on one hinge. There was a sealed envelope in the oilcloth bundle that she still had not opened. She had been saving it. She had understood without being able to explain why that the envelope was the last thing the thing she needed to read, only after she understood everything that came before it. She thought about that envelope on the drive back. She thought about the handwriting across the front. To whoever carries the Marsh name forward. Duke was waiting at the gate when they pulled up. He had learned the sound of Della's truck and always came to the fence when he heard it. He stood watching as Nora climbed out his tail, moving in that careful, measured way of his. She scratched behind his ear and looked at the lot, at the cleared foundation, at the half-built wall frames she and Orrin had been working on, the lumber still pale and clean, the nails set flush, at the tarp shelter where the oilcloth bundle was waiting. She was not ready to open the envelope yet, but she was getting closer. She had 25 days before the Board of Supervisors hearing. She had a challenge to the sale, an attorney arguing that the bonds were public assets, a man with resources and patience, and a family history of getting what he wanted from this county. She also had a deed, a journal, a photograph of her grandfather standing in front of the tower he had built with a grin on his face and his whole life ahead of him. And she had the knowledge which she had not had 4 days ago, that she was not a person who came from nowhere. She was a person who came from here. From this lot, this foundation, this ground. Whatever Reed Hargrove intended to do in the next 25 days, he was going to have to do it to someone who knew exactly where she stood. She opened the envelope that evening. She had waited long enough. She understood the story now, or enough of it, the shape of what had happened, and what it had cost, and what had been left behind. She sat in the shelter with Duke settled beside her, and the work lamp burning, and the oilcloth bundle open on her knee, and she broke the seal on the yellowed envelope with her thumbnail and unfolded 2 pages of Walter's aged handwriting, the letters formed with care despite the unsteadiness of the hand that made them. To whoever carries the Marsh name forward, he had written, if you are reading this, you found your way here. You found the tower, or what is left of it. You found the chamber I built into the foundation when I was 30 years old, and still believe that a man could outsmart the people who wanted to take what he had built by hiding the most important things underground. I still believe that, as it turns out, the chamber held. You are the proof. My name is Walter Marsh. I was the water commissioner of Harlan, Kansas from 1955 to 1961. I designed and built the municipal water system for this town. I hired 4 men, and we spent 14 months laying pipe and welding steel and pouring concrete and testing pressure gauges at midnight because I could not sleep until I knew the numbers were right. When the system came online in the spring of 1958, every faucet in Harlan ran clean water. Every kitchen, every bathroom, every house on every road in this county that I had run pipe to. I was 30 years old, and it was the best thing I had ever done, and I was proud of it in a way that I have never been ashamed of. They took it from me. Not the work itself, the work is permanent. Water still flows through those pipes, whether my name is attached to them or not. But they took my position and my standing and my home, and eventually, through a series of consequences I could not control, they took my family. A man named Edmund Hargrove wanted to own what I had built, and when I would not give it to him, he found another way to get it. That is the short version. The journal has the longer one. I am writing this letter in the fall of 2012. I am 84 years old, and I am driving back to Harlan tomorrow to place this letter in the box that has been sealed in this foundation for 51 years. My cardiologist would not approve of this plan. He is a careful man, and I have not told him about it. If you are Nora, my granddaughter, I want you to know certain things. I know you exist. I have known since February of 2010 when a woman from the state of Ohio called me and told me that Diana had died and that she had a daughter. You were 4 years old when I found out you were in the world. I asked for you immediately. I asked before the woman on the phone had finished explaining the situation. The state said no. I was too old, too sick, too alone to be considered a suitable guardian. I went to the courthouse in Jefferson City twice. I wrote 6 letters to the Foster Care Oversight Board. I called the caseworker every month for a year. They said no, each time in different language with different explanations, but the answer was always no. I sent you things: a blanket, a photograph of your mother as a baby, a letter. I do not know if any of it reached you. These things were sent through institutions, and institutions are imperfect, and sometimes the imperfection falls hardest on the people who can least afford it. You were not forgotten. I want you to understand that in whatever way the words on a page can convey a thing that was felt across years and distance, not for a single day. If you are not Nora, that is all right too. Whoever you are, you found this place. You cared enough to look, or you were brought here by some combination of circumstance and persistence that amounted to the same thing. The bonds are yours. The land is yours. The photographs and the journal are yours. Do with them what seems right. What I want for Nora, if she is reading, and for whoever else might be, is this. I built this tower to give a town something it needed: clean water, the most basic thing. I built this chamber to give a future to whoever came next, because when everything else was taken from me, the one thing I could still control was what I left behind in the ground I had worked. Build something. Stay. Those were the only instructions he left. Nora folded the letter and held it against her chest with both arms. She sat that way for a long time, eyes open, looking at the opposite wall of the shelter. Duke breathed steadily at her feet. Outside, the night was clear and cold and full of stars. He had made the drive. He had opened the foundation and placed the letter and sealed the panel, and then driven away for the last time in 40 miles from Harlan. His heart had stopped. She had thought about that sequence of events many times since reading the newspaper article in the library, turning it over, examining it from different angles. The part that she kept returning to was the order of it. He had done the work first. Whatever happened on Route 11, whatever the last minutes in that truck had been like, he had already done the thing he came to do. The letter was placed. The box was sealed. The foundation had held for 13 more years until Duke dug at the seam on a Tuesday morning in September. She thought about that when the hearing felt too large and too close, and the 30-day clock was running faster than she had expected. She started the next morning. She did not wait for Della to suggest a course of action or for Orrin to arrive with tools and steady company. She woke before dawn and lay in the dark making a list in her head, methodical the way Walter had been methodical, the way Ruth had been methodical, the way the women in her family apparently became when circumstances required it. She needed the original financial records from Walter's tenure as water commissioner. She needed the complete text of the county master plan, not a summary, the full document. She needed the original council meeting minutes from March 1961, not a transcript, not an archived summary, but the actual filed minutes with every signature and every recorded vote. She needed all of it in hand before she walked into that hearing room. She went to the county clerk's office when it opened at 8. Marion Harmon was at her desk. Nora asked for the full 2022 master plan and the commercial overlay documentation. Marion pulled both without comment and made copies at no charge, something she was not required to do and did anyway, with the quiet efficiency of a woman who understood which side of this she was on, without needing it, explained. She went to the county records archive in the basement of the courthouse. A young man named Terry ran at a recent history graduate who had taken the archival position while he figured out what came next and had developed a genuine affection for old documents in the meantime. Nora told him what she was looking for. He knew exactly where it was. The financial records from the Water Department 1955 through 1961 were stored in a gray, acid-free box on the third shelf of aisle 7. Terry carried them to the reading table, and put on his cotton gloves and opened the box with the care he gave to everything in his keeping. The records were dense columns of figures and purchase orders and signed receipts in Walter's precise handwriting. Everything dated, everything cross-referenced, everything exactly as the 1960 audit had found it. She photographed every page with the disposable camera she bought at the gas station on the way. It was the cheapest documentation method available to her, and it would work. The March 1961 council minutes took longer. They were in a different section of the archive, filed with the general municipal records for that year, and Terry had to look through 2 boxes before he found the right folder. When he opened it, he spread the contents on the table, and Nora leaned forward. There were 2 sets of documents: a 2-page summary of the March 14, 1961 council meeting, the kind of condensed record that was typed up and distributed to interested parties, and behind it, fastened with a rusted paperclip, the original handwritten minutes in their entirety, 12 pages, in a careful clerical hand, recording everything said and done in that meeting, from the call to order to the final adjournment. Nora read the full minutes from beginning to end. The motion to restructure the Water Commission was introduced on page 6. The language was dry and administrative, the kind of language designed to make a deliberate act sound like a procedural necessity. Motion to restructure the Department of Water Services and establish a new position of Water Resources Manager in place of the existing Water Commissioner role. She read the sponsorship line. Motion introduced and seconded by Council Member E. Hargrove. She read it again. Edmund Hargrove had not merely lobbied other council members to support the restructuring. He had introduced the motion himself from his seat on the council, using his official authority as an elected member of the town government to formally propose the removal of the man who had refused to give him control of the water supply. He had written the motion. He had seconded it himself, which technically required a different member's second, but the minutes recorded it as self-seconded without note of irregularity. And then he had voted in favor of it. A council member with a direct financial interest in the outcome of that vote had introduced, championed, and voted on the motion that eliminated Walter Marsh's position. In 1961, the conflict of interest provisions in Kansas municipal law were less explicit than they became in later decades, but they existed. They had existed then. No one had raised them. No one had asked Edmund Hargrove to recuse himself. No investigation had ever followed. Terry was watching her from across the table. "I need copies of both sets of minutes," Nora said. "The summary and the full original. Every page." He made them without being asked twice. She spent the following 2 weeks building her case the way Walter had built the water system, methodically, and with attention to the sequence of steps that had to come in the right order. She organized the documents into a folder, chronological, tabbed with handwritten labels. She wrote out what she intended to say at the hearing in the evenings after Orrin left, sitting at the small table she had assembled from reclaimed lumber, writing longhand and then reading it back aloud to see where the logic held and where it needed to be tighter. She did not hire a lawyer. She had looked into it. The attorneys she could access were general practitioners in the nearest larger town who quoted hourly rates she could not sustain for the duration of a county board proceeding. She made the decision not from recklessness, but from the same calculation Walter had made when he documented every dollar with his own hand, knowing that the cleanest defense was the record itself. She went to see people. She drove Della's truck to Orrin's house on a Tuesday evening and sat at his kitchen table and told him what she knew about Edmund Hargrove and the 1961 minutes and what she needed from him at the hearing. Not testimony about the legal merits, she wasn't asking for that. Just presence. Just a man who had lived in this county for 72 years, standing up and saying what he knew. Orrin listened. He nodded once when she finished. "I'll be there," he said. She went to Hank's lumberyard. Hank loaded her into a folding chair in the back of his office and listened to the same presentation and said the same thing Orrin had said, and added that he would bring 2 other people from the county agricultural cooperative who he thought would want to be there. She went to the diner and talked to the owner, a woman named Marlene, who had run Rosie's for 22 years and whose grandmother had been one of the first residents to get running water when Walter's system came online in 1958. Marlene listened, and then she called someone on her cell phone right there at the counter and had a brief conversation and said, "We'll have 4 people at that hearing." She went to Dave the plumber who had run the water line to the lot. Dave said he had been planning to come anyway and that he was bringing his son. She did not make speeches at any of these stops. She told the story plainly and showed the documents when they were relevant and let people make their own decisions. That was what she had learned from watching Walter's journal entries about the council meetings where he had laid out his case against Hargrove's proposal clearly and factually without theater. The theater hadn't helped him. The facts had been right, but the room had already made up its mind. She was building a different kind of room. On the evening before the hearing, Nora sat on the cleared foundation in the late light with Duke beside her, and the folder in her lap, and went through the documents one final time. The hearing was at 9 in the morning. She had pressed her good jeans and the cleanest shirt she owned. She had the original journal in a separate bag carefully wrapped. She had the photographs. Della came by just before dark with a thermos of coffee and sat on an upturned concrete block without being invited and without needing to be. "You ready?" she said. "I think so." Della poured 2 cups from the thermos and handed one over. "You know what your grandfather would have done tomorrow morning?" "What?" "Exactly what you're doing." Della looked at the half-built wall frame across the foundation. He was not a complicated man. He did his work, he kept his records, and when someone challenged the work, he showed them the records. She drank her coffee. The problem in 1961 was that the records were in a room full of people who had already been bought. Tomorrow's room is different. Nora thought about that. She thought about the 12 pages of original minutes sitting in the folder on her knee, the line that read, "Motion introduced and seconded by Council Member E. Hargrove." "Yeah," she said. "Tomorrow's room is different." The County Board of Supervisors met in a hearing room on the second floor of the courthouse, a rectangular space with fluorescent lighting and 4 rows of folding chairs facing a long table where the 5 board members sat. The chairman was a woman named Dr. Patricia Webb, a veterinarian who had served on the board for 9 years and ran her meetings with the precise efficiency of someone who had learned to make decisions under pressure. The room was more full than Nora had expected. Orrin was in the second row. Hank was beside him with 2 men from the agricultural cooperative. Marlene from the diner was in the third row with 3 other people Nora recognized from around town. Dave the plumber was near the back with his son. The woman from the church who had brought fried chicken to the lot was in the corner. The librarian was there. Terry from the county archive was there, which surprised her, but she was grateful for it. Reed Hargrove sat at a table to the left of the central aisle with his attorney, a man named Calloway, who had a leather briefcase and the kind of suit that signals a particular level of hourly rate. Reed wore a sport coat and no tie. He had not looked at Nora when she walked in. Dr. Webb called the meeting to order and read the formal complaint into the record. Calloway spoke first. He was organized and smooth, the presentation clearly prepared over several weeks, and he walked the board through the commercial overlay argument with professional efficiency. The 2022 Master Plan, the procedural requirement attached to commercial zone parcels, the assessor's failure to follow that requirement before listing Lot 14 as surplus. The sale in Hargrove's position was procedurally void regardless of whether the county clerk had followed standard surplus auction protocol. Then he raised the financial asset question. The savings bonds recovered from the property, he said, had been purchased using salary paid from county appropriations. Under Kansas statute, assets purchased through public funds remain potentially subject to public claim regardless of who held them. His client intended to pursue that argument in a separate petition to ensure the assets were properly examined before any disbursement. It was the same argument the letter had described. Clean on the surface, constructed to create enough uncertainty to freeze everything in place while the legal machinery ground forward. Calloway spoke for 17 minutes. Then Dr. Webb looked at Nora. Nora stood and walked to the front of the room. She had no podium. She stood in the open space between the chairs and the board's table and held the folder at her side. Her hands were steady. She was surprised by how steady they were. "My name is Nora Marsh," she said. "I am 20 years old. I bought Lot 14 at the county surplus auction for $5 because I was homeless and I needed somewhere to sleep. My car had broken down on Route 11, and I had walked into Harlan with $57 in my pocket, and I bought the only thing that was priced within my reach. The room was quiet in the way of people who are listening rather than waiting to respond. After I bought the lot, she said I found a sealed chamber in the foundation of the collapsed water tower. I want to explain what that means. The water tower that stood on Lot 14 was built between 1957 and 1958 by my grandfather, Walter Marsh, who served as water commissioner for Harlan from 1955 to 1961. He designed the municipal water system that supplies this town. He built the chamber into the foundation before he left, and he sealed it with his records and his life savings in a letter inside it. She opened the folder and removed the photograph of Walter. She held it up so the board could see it. This is Walter Marsh in 1957, standing in front of the tower while it was being built. She set the photograph on the edge of the board's table. Then she removed the journal and set it beside the photograph. This is the journal he kept during his years as water commissioner. It documents every decision he made, every dollar he spent, and what happened to him after Edmund Hargrove decided he wanted to own the water system Walter had built. She looked at Reed. He was looking at the table. The county conducted a financial audit of Walter's water department in 1960 in response to questions raised by Edmund Hargrove. She removed the audit summary from the folder and set it on the table. The audit found no financial irregularities of any kind. Every dollar was accounted for. Every purchase order matched every receipt. The savings bonds in question were purchased from Walter's personal salary documented in his own records, documented in the county payroll records, and documented in the audit that cleared him completely. The argument that those bonds represent public assets is the same argument Edmund Hargrove tried to make against Walter Marsh 64 years ago. It was wrong then. It is wrong now. She took a breath. I am not an attorney. I don't have one with me today. What I have is the record. I have what my grandfather kept because he was the kind of man who understood that the record was the only thing nobody could take from him. She reached into the folder for the last time and removed the council minutes. Both sets, the summary and the original 12 pages. She set them on the board's table side by side. The county assessor's filing of Lot 14 as surplus was procedurally proper. The parcel had been vacant for 8 years. The 90-day review window passed without objection. Hargrove Development had 2 years to raise concerns about the commercial overlay during that window and filed nothing. She pointed to the original minutes. But I want to address something else. Mr. Calloway has argued that the 2022 master plan created an obligation that the assessor failed to meet. He has also argued in the letter his firm sent me that Edmund Hargrove's removal of my grandfather in 1961 was a lawful exercise of council authority. I want the board to look at the original minutes from the March 14, 1961 council meeting. She waited while Dr. Webb and the other board members picked up the pages and found the relevant section. The motion to restructure the Water Commission and eliminate my grandfather's position was introduced by Council Member Edmund Hargrove. It was seconded by Council Member Edmund Hargrove. He then voted in favor of it. A council member with a direct financial interest in the outcome of that vote, a man who had been publicly and explicitly pursuing control of the water system my grandfather had refused to give him, used his official authority to introduce and vote on the motion that removed my grandfather from office. The room was still. That conflict of interest was never investigated. It was never raised. Edmund Hargrove got what he wanted because nobody in this room in 1961 chose to say what was plainly visible in that vote. I am not here to relitigate 1961. I am here because the same family is using the same method again. Create doubt where there is none. File challenges that don't hold up but cost enough time and money to make the other person go away. She looked at the board. I am not going away. This land is mine. My grandfather poured the foundation under it with his own hands. He sealed his whole life in it and drove back here at 84 years old with a bad heart to make sure something would be waiting for whoever came next. He died 40 miles from this courthouse on a dirt road doing exactly that. She stepped back. I have nothing else to add. She sat down. Duke, who she had tied to the bench outside, was quiet. The room was quiet. Dr. Webb set down the council minutes and looked at her colleagues. Then she looked at Calloway. Then she looked at Reed. Reed was looking at the original minutes. He had picked them up from the table and he was reading the sponsorship line. His expression was controlled, but something had shifted in it, the stillness of a man confronting something he would rather not confront in public. Calloway said something quiet to him and Reed shook his head once. "Does anyone from the public wish to speak?" Dr. Webb said. Orrin stood. He was 72 years old and he stood like a man who had been standing in difficult weather for decades and had learned not to let it show. "I have lived in this county for 72 years, he said. "I have spent 40 of them as a carpenter. I have been helping Miss Marsh build on that lot for the past 6 weeks. She works harder than anyone I have seen in 4 decades of construction, and she has done it in conditions most people would not have lasted 3 days in." He paused. "This county has owed the Marsh family something for 60 years. The least we can do is let his granddaughter keep the land." He sat down. Della stood. She said 4 sentences. "Walter Marsh built the system that gives this town its water. His granddaughter found the foundation he left for her and has been building on it with her own hands since September. I watched her do it. The land is hers." Dave stood. Hank stood. Marlene from the diner stood and spoke about her grandmother running the kitchen tap in 1958 and what that had meant for a woman who had carried water her whole life. 3 other people stood. Each one said something different in the same thing. The board deliberated for 14 minutes. Dr. Webb came back to the table and the room went quiet again. "The board has reviewed the complaint filed by Hargrove Development regarding the surplus auction of Lot 14, she said. "We find that the assessor's filing was conducted in accordance with established county procedures for surplus parcels and that no procedural violation occurred during the 90-day review period or the subsequent auction. The challenge is denied. The sale stands." She looked at Nora. "The property is yours, Miss Marsh." Nora thanked the board. She gathered the documents and replaced them in the folder. She walked out of the hearing room on legs that felt disconnected from the rest of her down the corridor and down the stairs and out through the courthouse's front door into the October morning, and she stopped on the steps in the cold air and breathed. Della was right behind her, Orrin beside her. Duke pulled at his leash from the bench where she had tied him and barked once short and declarative when he saw her come through the door. She unclipped him and he pressed against her leg, and she stood on the courthouse steps with the October sun on her face and the folder under her arm and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. "It's yours," Della said. Nora didn't say anything. She scratched Duke behind the ear and looked out at Main Street, in the grain elevator at the far end, in the water tower in the distance, with the town's name in letters that had faded to gray. "Let's go to the bank," Orrin said. "It's time." Mrs. Porter at First National was the same woman who had looked at the bonds 2 weeks earlier and told Nora she would need to wait for the full verification process to complete. With the deed confirmed and the hearing resolved, and the paperwork Nora brought with her documenting her lineage through Diana to Walter, the process moved forward that afternoon. 16 bonds, Series E, issued between 1956 and 1962, all at final maturity. Mrs. Porter set down her pen and looked at Nora with an expression that was professional and warm, and something else underneath both of those things. "The combined matured value," she said, "is $52,341. Nora sat with her hands clasped in her lap. She heard the number. It arrived in her mind the way large numbers sometimes do, as an abstraction, first a sequence of syllables before it became real. She asked Mrs. Porter to repeat it. $52,341. Nora thanked her and said she would return tomorrow to begin the disbursement process, and walked out of the bank into the afternoon sun and got into Della's truck in the parking lot and sat there. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. The vinyl was warm from the afternoon sun and slightly worn where hands had rested on it for years. She stayed that way for several minutes. Then she cried. The real kind, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and structural, the kind that doesn't make noise but takes everything you have to move through. She cried for Walter driving 9 hours with a failing heart to leave something for a granddaughter he had never met. She cried for Diana, who had spent her life running from a father who had only ever wanted to give her things and had never been able to make her feel safe enough to stop. She cried for Ruth, who had worked 2 jobs and fixed the landlord's plumbing and taught Nora to hold a wrench and never once mentioned Harlan or Walter or any of it, whether because she didn't know or because the past was too painful to carry forward. She cried for herself at 14, lying in a group home in Columbus, believing with complete certainty that she had come from nothing. She was not nothing. She had never been nothing. She had just been too far from here to know what she was. When she drove back to the lot, Orrin was already there with his tape measure and a look on his face that said he understood approximately what the afternoon had contained and was not going to make her talk about it. "I staged some lumber," he said, nodding toward the cleared space beside the foundation. "We can start on the workshop frame tomorrow if you're ready." She had made the decision about the workshop before the hearing. The money had not changed the decision, only made it possible. Walter had built the water system to give the town something it needed. The town still needed things. She was her grandfather's granddaughter, and she had his hands and his inclination towards systems that worked and served people, and the lot was large enough for what she had in mind. A community workshop, free to anyone who showed up, tools available, instruction available, a space where people could come to build or fix or learn. Not a business, not a revenue source. A resource the same way clean water was a resource available because someone had decided it should be. She woke the next morning to an engine on Tower Road. A flatbed delivery truck had stopped at the gate. 2 men were unloading stacks of lumber and setting them along the fence line with practiced efficiency, framing lumber straight and dry, plywood in sheets, a pallet of roofing material. Nora came out of the shelter and walked to the gate. "Who sent this?" she said to the driver. He checked his clipboard. Delivery order paid in full. He held out the receipt. No name on the account. She took the receipt and looked at it. The delivery was comprehensive. Enough lumber to complete her house and frame the workshop both. Better stock than she had been buying, the kind of material that costs more per board foot because it was cut and dried properly and would not warp. The driver climbed back into the cab. The truck turned around on Tower Road and she watched it go. As it completed the turn, she saw the logo on the tailgate, the letters on the door panel, the company name printed in a clean font above the driver's door. Hargrove Development. She stood at the gate holding the receipt and looked at it for a long time. Duke sat beside her. His tail swept the gravel in a slow arc. She folded the receipt and put it in her jacket pocket. She did not say anything about it to Orrin when he arrived. She did not need to. The lumber was real. The work was real. Some things were better left in the space between what a person did and what they said about it. Reed came to the lot once more 6 days later alone. No attorney, no SUV. He arrived in a plain pickup truck and wore jeans and work boots and stopped at the gate the way he had that first time, as if he needed to decide whether he was coming in. He had his daughter with him, a girl of about 9 with dark braids and serious eyes, wearing a jacket with the collar turned up. "This is Elise," Reed said. "She wants to learn how to build something." Orrin was at the far workbench. He looked over when he heard the voice and then looked at Nora. "Orrin teaches the Saturday class," Nora said. "He's got a birdhouse kit at the third bench." Reed nodded. He walked his daughter across the foundation to where Orrin was working, and Orrin handed Elise a piece of pre-cut pine and a small hammer without ceremony or comment. Reed stood back and watched his daughter study the wood in her hands with that seriousness children bring to new things when they genuinely want to learn. He stood there for most of the afternoon. He didn't work. He didn't talk much. He watched Elise make mistakes and correct them with Orrin's quiet guidance, drive a nail crooked and pull it out, and drive it straight, measure a piece of wood twice, and mark it with the pencil Orrin kept behind his ear. By the end of the afternoon, she had a lopsided birdhouse that was structurally sound and that she carried in both hands with visible pride. Before Reed walked back to the truck with his daughter, he stopped at Nora's workbench. She was fitting a door frame into the rough opening of the workshop's south wall. She had a good time, he said, nodding toward Elise. She's welcome back any time, Nora said. He was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable, just quiet. The quiet of a man choosing his words carefully before he said them. I'm sorry, he said, about the hearing, about all of it. She looked at him. His face was open in a way it hadn't been at the auction or the first time he had come to the lot with his business card. The practiced composure was still there, but it wasn't the only thing there anymore. I know, she said. He walked his daughter to the truck. Nora watched them go and then went back to the door frame. Orrin came over and stood beside her and looked at the fit of the frame in the opening. Not bad, he said. She shimmied the low corner, and he handed her the level without being asked. The workshop took 3 more weeks to complete. She worked on it every morning and most afternoons, and Orrin came 6 days a week and twice brought his neighbor's son, a young man in his 20s, who was between jobs and who turned out to have a natural aptitude for framing that Orrin identified on the first day and quietly developed over the following ones. The community came in the gradual way that Della had described, not as a coordinated effort, but as individual decisions that accumulated into something that looked like momentum. Dave ran a water line to the property from the main road connection free of charge on a Saturday when his teenage son tagged along and learned to cut pipe. Hank from the lumber yard brought a donation of finished nails and a belt sander that he said was taking up space in his storage. Marlene from Rosie sent lunch 3 days in a row with a teenager in a diner apron who shrugged and said Marlene told me to when Nora tried to ask about it. The workshop was built on the north half of the foundation using the concrete slab as the floor and reclaimed steel from the tower's wreckage for the structural frame. The roof was corrugated metal. 3 sides were open with canvas panels that could be rolled down in bad weather. A long workbench ran the length of the south wall. Tools hung from a pegboard that Della donated from the store's back room, organized by type and size. A system Nora had designed from the one Ruth had used in their apartment building's utility closet. It was not fancy. It was solid and functional, and it worked. Nora completed her house the week before the workshop opened. The last thing she did was install the front door herself, fitting the hinges and setting the latch and hanging the door on a frame she had built from scratch. She swung it open and closed several times, checking the plumb, adjusting the strike plate. When it sat right, when it closed clean and opened smooth, she stood in the doorway for a moment with one hand on the frame. The wood was pine clear-grained cut and sanded until the grain showed straight and even under her palm. She had cut it and sanded it herself. She had fitted every joint. She could feel the texture of it in a way that was different from touching wood that someone else had made, because she knew which decisions had gone into every inch of it, and she knew when those decisions had been right and when she had corrected a mistake and what the correction had cost. This was what Ruth had meant. The best thing about fixing something is that it stays fixed. And building something, Nora had learned, was the same principle extended forward. You make it right and it stays right. The plumb wall stays plumb. The fitted door stays fitted. The sealed chamber stays sealed for 51 years in the ground of the town where the man who built it did his best work. She was 20 years old. She had a deed to a half-acre in Harlan, Kansas, and a house she had built with her own hands on the foundation her grandfather had poured nearly 70 years ago, and a workshop where people could come to learn and build and fix whatever in their lives had come apart. She had $52,000 less what she had spent on materials and a water hookup and 6 weeks of food that was better than gas station sandwiches. She had Della, who came by most evenings and never stayed too long and always brought something to eat that she claimed was leftovers. She had Orrin, who came on Sundays now for dinner as well as construction, and who had stopped building birdhouses entirely. She had Duke, who had recovered full use of his injured leg over the course of the fall, and who patrolled the perimeter of the lot each morning with the methodical attention of an animal that took his responsibilities seriously. On a Tuesday in late October, she was at the workbench sharpening chisels when she heard footsteps on the gravel outside. She looked up. A girl was standing at the gate, 17 maybe, thin in the way of someone who has not been eating consistently. She wore a hoodie that was too large for her and sneakers with the soles separating at the toe, and she was carrying a garbage bag in one hand the kind of bag that people carry when they have more things than they have proper luggage to put them in. She stood at the gate and looked at the workshop and the house and Duke and Nora with the careful assessment of a person who has learned that new places are usually worse than the last one. "Can I help you?" Nora said. "I saw the sign on the highway," the girl said. "Community workshop, free tools and classes." Nora had put that sign up 2 weeks ago on a sheet of plywood with a can of spray paint. Della had told her it looked homemade. Nora had said that was the point. "That's us," she said. "Come in." The girl hesitated. Then she walked through the gate, the bag bumping against her leg. Duke walked over and sniffed her hand and then went back to his spot in the sun. That was as close to an endorsement as Duke gave people he didn't know yet. "I'm Nora." "Jesse, you hungry, Jesse?" The girl looked at the workbench and the tools in the house and back at Nora. "Yeah," she said. Nora went inside and made sandwiches and heated the soup Della had brought the previous evening. They sat at the workbench and ate. Jessie ate quickly and without entirely relaxing, with one part of her attention always on the possibility that the meal might not continue. Nora did not comment on it. She knew exactly what that looked like because she had done it herself, and she knew that having someone comment on it made it worse. She talked instead about the workshop and what they built there and the Saturday class Orrin was going to start running in November. She told the story about Orrin gluing his hand to a sawhorse during a demonstration last week and having to call Della for acetone. Jessie smiled at that, a small, careful smile that looked like it hadn't been used much recently, but had not forgotten how. After lunch, Nora showed her how to use a hand plane. Jessie picked it up quickly, taking long, even strokes along a piece of pine, reading the grain without being told to, adjusting her pressure when the blade started to chatter. "You've done this before," Nora said. "My last foster placement." Jessie said, not looking up. "The dad had a garage. He taught me some things before the home closed." Nora watched her work. The stance was good. The hands were steady. "I have a spare room," Nora said. Jessie looked up. "It's small, just a bed and a dresser. The stove keeps the whole house warm and there's hot water." Nora met her eyes. "I was where you are 2 years ago, sleeping in a car, eating whatever I could afford, no address. Someone let me stay. I'm doing the same." Jessie looked at the house. She looked at Duke and his patch of sun. She looked at the tools on the pegboard and the foundation that had been here since 1957. "For how long?" she said. "As long as you need. What if I mess something up? Then we'll fix it. That's what workshops are for." Jessie moved in that afternoon with the garbage bag and nothing else. Nora gave her the room, a set of clean sheets, a towel, and showed her where the food was. She heard the shower run for 45 minutes that evening and did not say a word about it. She understood about unlimited hot water. You stood in it until the feeling of it became ordinary again. That took longer than anyone on the outside of that experience would expect. Over the following days, Jessie settled into the household the way a cautious animal settles into a new space, carefully taking up as little room as possible, at first testing the consistency of things before trusting them. Nora gave her room. She showed up at meals and let the rest go to time. Jessie started helping in the workshop within a week. She swept sawdust, organized tools by size on the pegboard, handed Orrin lumber during the Saturday class without being asked. Orrin treated her the same way he treated everyone, with patient instruction and the dry economy of a man who believed most things could be explained in fewer words than people usually used. "You're holding that saw like it owes you money," he told her during her first lesson. "Relax your grip. The blade does the work, not your forearm." Della brought extra food when she came by with the same architecture of plausible excuses she had always used. "I made too much stew. The bakery gave me extra bread. These apples will go bad if someone doesn't eat them." Jessie accepted it all without comment, and Nora noticed her eating more slowly as the days passed, more present in the meal, less braced against its disappearance. One afternoon, Nora drove Jessie to the high school in town to talk about enrollment. Jessie sat in the truck staring at the building. "I haven't been in a school in almost 2 years," she said. "I hadn't been in one in 6 when I started studying for my G." Said, You don't have to figure it all out today. Just show up tomorrow. Jesse looked at her. Why do you care what happens to me? Nora thought about Della with the water jug on day 4. She thought about Orrin at the gate with his toolbox after 3 weeks of watching from the road. She thought about Walter sealing a box into the ground for someone he would never meet. Because somebody cared what happened to me, she said, and the only way to pay that back is forward. Jesse enrolled the next day. The workshop opened officially on a Saturday in November, though it had been operating informally for weeks by then. Orrin's carpentry class drew 11 people the first morning, which was more than either of them had anticipated. A father and his teenage son working on a bookshelf, 2 women from the church quilting group learning to use a table saw, with the particular seriousness of people approaching something they had been told their whole lives was not for them. A man Nora knew only as Ruiz, who was restoring an antique rocking chair he had pulled from the side of the road. Nora stood at the edge of the foundation that first morning with a cup of coffee and watched people work. The October sun was warm on her face. Wildflowers had pushed up through the gravel along the fence line, yellow and purple, claiming ground the weeds had held for years. She thought about Walter writing in his journal about the day the water system came online, about driving the routes to check the pressure, about the elderly woman on the north edge of town who stood at her kitchen tap and didn't say anything for a long time. That moment was the kind of thing he chose to write down because it was the point of the whole thing, not the engineering, not the budget, not the specifications, but the woman with the tap running and the water finally coming out. This was her version of that moment. The people at the workbenches, the sound of hammers and the smell of cut wood, and the particular hum of people learning something with their hands. On a Saturday in late November, Nora looked up from her workbench and saw Reed Hargrove walking through the gate. He had a girl with him, 8 or 9 years old, with dark braids and the serious expression of a child who has already decided she is going to be good at whatever this is. Elise, he had said the first time he brought her. She carries a lopsided birdhouse in both hands like a trophy the same way she had the month before. She's back, Nora said. She talked about it for a week, Reed said. He stopped at the gate, not quite coming in, the same hesitation as that first day with the business card, except that everything else about him was different. He held his daughter's hand, and the grip was easy, not for show. Orrin's at the third bench, Nora said. He's got a new kit, bigger this time. Reed walked Elise to the bench. Orrin looked at the girl and then at Reed with the level assessment he gave everything, and then handed Elise a piece of wood and a pencil without a word of introduction. Reed stepped back and watched his daughter go to work. He stayed 2 hours. He watched Elise more than the room. Near the end of the afternoon, he came to stand beside Nora's workbench, where she was planning a section of shelf stock for a set of shelves she was building along the interior wall of the workshop. She's going to want to come back every week, Reed said. The door's open every Saturday, Nora said. He was quiet in the way she had come to recognize the quiet of a man assembling something before he released it. My grandfather did a wrong thing, he said, and I tried to use it to do another one. He looked at the foundation under their feet at the concrete Walter had poured in 1957 when he was 27 years old and building something to last. I should have looked at the history before I filed anything. If I had, I would have seen what you showed the board. You had other information, Nora said. I had information I chose not to look past. There's a difference. She set down the plane. She looked at him. Your daughter's welcome here as long as she wants to come, she said. And so are you if you ever want to learn something. He looked at the workshop, at the tools on the pegboard, and the people at the benches, and the corrugated metal roof above it all. He nodded once. Then he went to get Elise, who had produced another birdhouse, this one slightly less lopsided than the first, and was showing it to Orrin with an analysis of what she had done differently. Nora watched them walk through the gate and load into the truck. The engine started. The truck pulled away down Tower Road, its taillights disappearing around the curve toward the highway. Orrin came to stand beside her. That takes something, he said. She nodded. It does. They stood there for a moment, looking at the empty road. Then she went back to the plane. The winter came in measured stages the way Kansas winters do each week, a degree colder than the last, until one morning in December, the ground was frozen and stayed that way. The workshop adapted. Orrin installed a propane heater along the north wall, and the canvas panels rolled down tight against the cold. People still came. Fewer than in the fall, but consistently the ones who had decided this was part of their week, regardless of weather. Jessie enrolled in school and went every day, which was the thing Nora had asked, and the only thing. She didn't ask about grades or teachers or whether Jessie was making friends. She figured those things would develop or they wouldn't, and either way, Jessie needed to find out for herself. What Nora could provide was the stable ground under it, the room with the bed and the dresser, the meals at the table, the certainty that the door would be there when she came back to it. She had had none of those things. She knew their value exactly. Della came by most evenings and stayed longer as the weather got colder, the visits expanding naturally from a quick drop-off to an hour at the kitchen table, the two of them talking about the hardware store and the workshop and whatever had happened in town that day. Della had a capacity for local knowledge that was genuinely encyclopedic, decades of people coming into her store and talking while she found their order. And she offered this knowledge without editorializing, as if the information were simply available and Nora could do with it what she chose. Orrin came on Sundays for dinner and had been doing so since October. He brought wine, sometimes the practical kind that came in a box, and sat at the table Nora had built from reclaimed lumber and ate whatever was made without commentary. He and Jessie had settled into a dynamic that neither of them had named, but that looked from outside like the wary mutual respect of two people who recognize certain things in each other. "You're good at tools," he told her one Sunday, not as encouragement, but as observation. "I know," she said. He nodded. "Don't waste it." She didn't. In January, Nora registered for 2 online courses through the State University's Extension program: Structural Engineering Fundamentals and Technical Drawing. The courses cost money she could afford now and would have laughed at a year ago. She studied at the kitchen table after dinner with a mechanical pencil and a ruler, and the particular concentration of someone who has finally found the subject that matches the shape of their mind. She had chosen structural engineering because of Walter, because she had read his journal entries about load calculations and pipe pressure and foundation design, and recognized in them the same satisfaction she felt when a wall came out plumb or a door swung true, the satisfaction of something being exactly what it was supposed to be. She wanted to understand the mathematics underneath it, the formal language for what she already knew intuitively from years of fixing things with Ruth and building things with Orrin. She also had a reason that was harder to articulate, but equally true. Harlan's water system was aging. The pipes Walter had laid in 1957 and 1958 were nearly 70 years old. Not all of them, the county had done sections of replacement work over the decades, but enough of the original infrastructure remained that the question of its future was a real one. Someday she thought someone in this county was going to need to understand how that system was built and what it would take to rebuild it. She intended to be that person. She told Della this one evening in February. They were sitting at the table with the remains of dinner between them and the wind coming in hard against the north wall of the house. Della looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandfather would understand that completely." "I know," Nora said. "That's why I'm doing it." On a Wednesday evening in March, Nora sat on the porch of her house with Duke at her feet and the journal open on her knee. The air still had an edge of cold in it, but the light was staying longer and there were green shoots along the fence line where the wildflowers were starting again. She had the journal open to the early entries, the ones from 1957 and 1958, the ones where Walter wrote about the system coming online and driving the routes to check the pressure. She had read these passages many times. She kept coming back to the one about the elderly woman on the north edge of town, the woman who stood at her kitchen tap and watched the water come out and didn't say anything for a long time. The simplicity of it. The water was there. It had not been there before. Now it was. That was the whole thing Walter had understood. The work was not about the engineering or the budget or the title on the office door. The work was about the water at the tap. Whatever came after, whatever Edmund Hargrove managed to take, he had not been able to take that. The water still ran. Inside the house, she could hear Jessie moving around in the spare room. The particular sounds of a person settling into a place that is becoming familiar. The shelf Jessie had built in November stood against the wall in there with her books on it, a row of them she had accumulated from the school library and the used bookstore on Main Street. There were more of them each week. Duke shifted at her feet and looked toward the lot. The workshop was dark at this hour, the tools on the pegboard invisible, the workbenches empty. In the morning, there would be people there. A woman named Carol who was learning to refinish furniture. The two men from the agricultural cooperative who had started coming to work on equipment repairs. Oren's Tuesday class for anyone who wanted to come. The neighborhood was quiet now, but it had the quality of quietness that comes before activity rather than after it. The hush of a space that knows it will be used again. She opened the journal to the inside front cover one last time. Walter Marsh, Water Commissioner, Harlan, Kansas, April 1955. She reached into her shirt pocket and took out the carpenter's pencil she had been carrying since the day Oren first handed her one. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the smooth hexagonal wood, the soft graphite tip. Then she placed the tip below Walter's line and wrote in her own hand, smaller than his, and less perfectly even the handwriting of someone still becoming sure of herself. Nora Marsh, Builder, Harlan, Kansas, October 2025. She closed the journal. The stars were out. The same stars she had seen her first night on this lot, sleeping on the ground under a tarp, with Duke's weight against her side, and $57 in her jacket, and no plan beyond making it to morning. She had been so afraid that night, the fear that comes when you have used your last option and are sitting inside it, wondering if it will hold. It had held. She had not known it would. She had not known about the chamber or the bonds or Walter or the journal or any of it. She had bought a pile of rubble because it was priced within her reach, and because a half-acre of land with her name on it was better than a highway shoulder, and it had turned out to be everything else too. She thought about the chain of things that had to be exactly as they were. The car breaking down on Route 11 rather than anywhere else. The auction being held on the day she walked into Harlan. The lot priced at $5 because nobody else wanted it. Duke in the fallen tank rather than somewhere else. And Walter, 84 years old, driving 9 hours with a heart that the doctors had told him couldn't take it, to open the foundation and place the letter and seal it again, completing the chain by adding the one element without which none of the rest would have meant what it meant. He had done his part. Now she was doing hers. Duke breathed steadily at her feet. Through the window behind her, the light in Jessie's room was still on the thin line of it under the door. A teenager reading late the particular defiance of staying up past when you should, because the book isn't finished and the house is warm, and you are for once exactly where you are supposed to be. Nora sat on the porch of the house she had built and looked at the lot her grandfather had loved and felt the specific weight of a life that had found its ground. Home is not where you are born, she thought. It is not where you are placed or sent or assigned. It is not the room they put you in while they figure out what to do with you next. Home is where you stop running. She had run out of road on Route 11 in September with $57 and a car that would never start again. And she had walked into a town she had never heard of, and she had bought the one thing nobody else wanted, and underneath it, her grandfather had been waiting with everything he had left to give. She was not running anymore.